there are really few protections, if any. And even when perhaps a law is broken, like, for example, Oregon has said, well, there have been cases where they didn't follow the guidelines, nothing happens.
Yeah.
So it really becomes a wild, wild west situation, especially since most of it is self-reporting by doctors who are going to say that they violated the law about as much as someone's going to tell the IRS they didn't pay their taxes.
Hello, I'm Anne McElhinney.
And I'm Phelim McAleer.
And welcome to the Anne and Phelim Scoop.
Yes, so we have been travelling, Anne McElhinney.
Yes, we're back now in Los Angeles, where the summer has decided to arrive, which is really rather comforting after a rather cold 6 months.
Yes. So where were we, Anne McElhinney?
We started out in Connecticut. We were in a number of towns in Connecticut. We were attending a funeral, and we went from the funeral to Bristol, Rhode Island, to meet Phelim's father's cousin, a retired priest, wonderful man, who retired from the missions. By the way, he had been in Peru.
Yes, he'd been in Peru at the same time as the present Pope.
But we were hugely disappointed to discover that, in fact, even though his time in Peru did coincide with the same time that the Pope was there, he didn't meet the said Pope, which was hugely disappointing to us.
Yes, we wanted a little bit of papal celebrity association, but we didn't get it. But anyway, we had a great time, actually. Very sharp. We talked about Vatican II. We talked about certain cardinals.
We did.
That we won't name because it's a private conversation. One thing that did strike me about meeting my 94-year-old cousin was that
possibly cousin once removed, I think, might be correct.
Or second cousin. Well, people tell us, is your father's cousin your second cousin or your first cousin once removed? Please answer in the comments.
People need to know.
Answer in the comment sections on YouTube. So, my 94-year-old cousin is mentally incomparable to the former president of the United States, Joe Biden. The acuity, as they used to say about Joe Biden before he was revealed in the debate, sharp as a tack.
Yes.
You should see him in meetings. Well, that's my cousin. And, so, I mean, people talk about Joe Biden and age. It wasn't the age. It was just he aged in a different way. And it's not in years, it's just how we age. So,
anyway, we've had a lot of new viewers and listeners to the podcast, and so we welcome you here. Thank you for coming. We are investigative journalists. We report on stories that are either ignored or underreported by the mainstream media, and we bring you the latest on the trans madness, on abortion, on
Me Too,
climate change, nonsense,
fracking,
all
of the good things. So I just want to, before we get into what's on, and we have a lot on the show, I mean, we have to talk about the attacks in Boulder, the attacks in DC, Ireland's madness, Christians getting attacked in Seattle, the whole thing.
But before we get to that, we want to talk about our train journey.
Yes.
Right?
So I think we need to two things: offer context and attribute blame.
That's true.
Because it's all about blame.
It's always about blame.
So we
took advice
from an American who for reasons to protect her privacy, her name starts with M and ends with Eleni, right? So no one will know who that is. And she said, first of all, when you arrive at JFK on the Friday
of Memorial Day weekend, whatever you do not get a car and drive. You have to take public transport.
So you have to go get a train into Penn Station. And
you've got to get a train from JFK to another place. Then from that place, you've got to take another train into Penn Station. And from there, you take a train to another place in Connecticut, which is not the place we needed to go to. So from there, we'd have to take
an Uber
to the hotel, which would then leave us still 5 miles from where we needed to go to the funeral.
And
we were going to do all that because she was.
But then we
said that was the right thing to do.
Then we would have to take an Uber back to the train station, get the train up to Providence, get an Uber over to meet my cousin, drive around with Ubers.
But we were going to do all this.
Then we were going to get an Uber to Providence, Rhode Island.
Anyway, on the plane from Los Angeles to JFK, I started to panic.
Yes, get an Uber. I just wanted everyone to know what we were
willing to do, because we were recommended that this would be kind of, stress-free, a sort of a stress-free way of doing things. Yes. But as I realised and started to think about it on the plane, I thought, you know what, I think we should rent a car.
Yes, so we did rent the car. But I want to say the last bit of the trip was Uber to Providence, and then 6.5 or 7 hour train journey because we had to go to DC after that, from Providence to DC. And
We did do that.
In our defense, or in M's defense, we did do that because the only way to fly directly from Providence to DC was a 6 a.m. flight on the Monday morning. And we thought, no, that's too much. So we rented our car out of JFK, and the trip to Connecticut should have taken 2 hours. It ended up taking 3 hours. So
wasn't bad at all.
We were warned it could take 7 hours or 8 hours. It didn't. And then we drove up to Rhode Island. Perfect. We got the train, the Acela,
which apparently was meant to be fabulous and very, very luxurious.
And business class. We went business class.
It was super, super expensive.
Unbelievably expensive.
So I thought, in my head, I was thinking, oh, white tablecloths, a really nice lunch or a really nice breakfast, like with sort of freshly baked croissants.
Let's show them the breakfast we got. Let's put that picture up
and let's show the beautiful dining car.
Yes, a dining car with all bar stools, so that when you're on fast of a train, and there weren't even bar stools with backs.
Extremely dangerous.
Extremely dangerous. So that is train journeys in America, in the Acela. It's hard.
There's nothing to recommend it.
Nothing to recommend it. Fly if you can, drive if you can.
Yeah. Get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and take the flight. There was an hour and a half and much, 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 much cheaper. Did I mention how much cheaper it was? Anyway, move on.
Move on.
We went to DC and we met.
Yes,
we went. We were guests on the War Room with Steve Bannon.
Yeah, our old friend.
Let's
Steve.
have a look at a little bit of that.
Welcome back. Two of my favorite people and two of the most creative people in the country, and particularly the MAGA movement, Phelim McAleer and Ann McElhenney. You guys are filmmakers. You also produce plays. You do of all the stuff you've done. I love all your material. What you did, I think it was on the Mueller report. You did a live, stage reading of it.
Yeah, and released it as a podcast. We also did the FBI Lovebirds.
So Steve was really kind and by the way, very, very, very generous in his praise of the kind of work that we do. We're so very, very happy to hear that and look forward to being on his show again.
Yes. So let's talk about today's show.
Mm-hmm.
What's on it? For all those progressives who lament that, the progressives, America is so less cultured than Europe. Well, America is finally catching up with European proclivities such as Jew hunting and Jew burning, and that sounds shocking to say that, but Jew hunting and Jew burning,
literally Jew hunting and Jew burning,
has come to America. Congratulations, America. And Ireland, it's top of the league in what, Anne?
In anti-Semitism, and it's only winning every prize.
Yes, so we bring you the latest anti-Israel. Anti-Israel, because it's not anti-Semitism, absolutely not, from the Emerald Isle. And when Christians get attacked by Antifa in Seattle, according to the local mayor, whose fault is it?
It's their own fault, Phelim, of course.
Victim blaming. And so our old friend, Josh Fox, the documentarian, the alleged documentarian who lied about fracking, lied about climate change, has apparently been working on a new documentary for 5 years.
5 years, Phelim.
It features a lying criminal fantasist, but Fox kind of knew that when he started. But now she's emerged as a lying criminal fantasist anti-Semite.
Well, that's a little bit awkward.
Because Josh Fox is Jewish. And by the way, he crowdfunded for this show almost 2 years ago. Where is this documentary? So we investigate. And what else? Oh yeah, burying the lead. Let's hear the music. Yes, this time we will look at, we just love this, where journalists accidentally...
Where there's an actual story and the journalist hates the actual story, but they have to report on something to do with the story because it is a really big story. And so what they do is...
Bury the lead.
They bury the lead.
Bury the story. So we love hearing from you. We're going to read some of the comments that we got last week and continue to get. So please keep making the comments. Oh, and please subscribe to our Substack, stories.io. We've had a lot of new subscribers. It's where we bring you stories, so it means you don't have to wait once a week to hear our stories, that you can get them every day. So on the show, we have to open with the story about the attempt to burn Jewish people marching peacefully in Boulder, Colorado.
Burn people alive at a peaceful march.
On Sunday there. The man who carried it out during a peaceful hostage awareness march, and he left 8 people in hospital. He threw petrol bombs, Molotov cocktails, whatever you want to call them. He had an improvised flamethrower. He's Mohammed Suleiman, as Mark Stein says. Why are all the bad things in the world carried out by someone called Mohammed?
Mm-hmm.
He told investigators he researched on YouTube how to make Molotov cocktails, purchased the ingredients to do so, and constructed them. This is just the latest attack on Jews in America. When we were in DC, we visited the Capitol Jewish Museum, As you can see there, pictures, flowers, candles mark the spot where Sarah Milgrim and Yaron Lischinsky were shot dead outside. The pictures show a couple, very young couple, and very much in love, living a kind of blessed life that comes from working for a high-profile embassy in America's capital city. They, there's pictures of them doing brunch and hanging with their friends and going running, all these things that you do.
So many people in Washington, D.C. remembered, suddenly thought, I remember I had a meeting with her or with him last week. There were so many of these photographs, so many people having these memories, and there were flowers outside. It's just incredibly sad.
Yeah, and Yaron had bought a ring the week before and was going to propose to his girlfriend, Sarah, during a forthcoming trip together.
To Jerusalem, I think it was. The following week.
Instead, their lives were ended when a leftist activist waited outside an event at the museum. And let's be clear, he didn't know that Yaron and Sarah worked for the Israeli embassy. This wasn't some targeted attack on people from the Israeli government. He did know they were Jewish. That was enough for him.
And he got that wrong because one of them was Christian, but it didn't matter. What he was doing was hunting down Jews.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
He walked up to them and shot them both several times, killing Yaron instantly. Sarah was severely wounded and was able to crawl away, fleeing for her life. The killer followed her, stood over her and put several more bullets into her as she lay on the ground. Then he reloaded the gun and fired again.
So Jew hunting, thought to be a relic of a dark European past, has come to modern-day progressive America, and that's not a coincidence.
No.
It has not arrived out of the blue. On October 8th, the day after October 7th, the victims were not yet buried, and in some instances, Hamas were still
killing people
in Israel, when American leftists and student organizations were announcing gleeful support or blaming Israel for the biggest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. Then there followed months of illegal encampments and violent protests on various college campuses. Jews were subjected to violence and intimidation and attacked for wearing kippahs or stars of David. The protesters had no compunction calling for a free Palestine from the river to the sea, therefore basically the obliteration of the Jewish state. Jewish students were ostracized in class. Professors openly called Israel a genocidal state. There was literally thousands of anti-Semitic incidents. And of course, what happens on campus never stays on campus. And so we had the firebombing in Colorado and the shooting of Yaron and Sarah outside the museum. I suppose it's right to say now the Jews are realizing the American golden age for Judaism is over. After World War II, anti-Semitism seemed to be disappearing in the United States. Most Jews were able to live, perhaps for the first time in their history, they were able to live in a country without fear of a pogrom or an attack for being Jewish, which is, must have been an amazing experience for Jewish people, which is why so many of them probably came here. And in this golden age, a lot of Jewish intellectuals and activists, they devoted their time and energy to, say, civil rights campaigns, trying to protect others they saw as discriminated.
To progressive causes, I suppose.
Progressive causes, yeah. They were at the forefront of the civil rights movement, offering legal assistance. In fact, and many times lost their lives.
That's right.
Mississippi burning, the
two of them were Jewish boys.
Yeah, two of the people murdered. They were allies.
This is important.
And a lot of good it did them after October 7th. As actress Julie Anna Margulies, who has been in ER and The Good Wife, she made that point on a podcast when she criticized black people for, quote, not embracing, close quotes, Jewish people, because, quote, in the civil rights movement, the Jews were the ones that walked side by side with the blacks to fight for their rights. She went on to say, the fact that the entire black community isn't standing with us, to me, says they don't know or they've been brainwashed to hate Jews. So actually, I think she's wrong there. I think what's happened is she doesn't understand the progressive movement. They create good people and bad people. So white people were systemically racist.
Yep.
Black people were good. Hispanics are good. And they just brought that model of identity politics over to Israel. So we saw that at the Capital Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C. Outside, it's October 7th, but inside, the Capital Jewish Museum is very much concerned with their allies.
Well, with every possible progressive idea that there is, basically. I don't think they miss any of them.
No.
They literally have all of them. They run the whole gamut from abortion to climate change and everything else in between, by the way, including Islamophobia, by the way. But the Jew, I was struck a little bit and a lot actually, by the large exhibition in favour of abortion and explaining why for Jews it's so important that nothing would ever interfere with any rights to abortion. And they justify that by, quoting from Exodus and also quoting from the Talmud.
Yes.
Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago, basically sacred texts from, but what's interesting then is, because that's fair enough, fine, whatever. And even, you could question those particular passages and all of that. And I'll just show some of them up there. A fetus is mere water for its first 40 days.
Can I just add, this is obviously written before we had ultrasounds.
Correct.
And so the debate might have moved on a bit.
Just a little.
Since then.
Yeah.
But that's not acknowledged in this exhibition. And then we get to what does the exhibition say then, Anne, about gay rights?
They would use the same, you'd imagine that they would use the same sort of logic or the same metrics, exactly. And they in fact do quote from the Bible, and they have Judaism and sexuality.
Yes.
And
unfortunately, Leviticus is, let's just say, rather strident on the issue of homosexuality. And let me quote it exactly. And with a man shalt thou not lie, as with a woman. It is an abomination.
But then you go on to find, and here's the exhibit, and here's what they said about it. Over time, rabbis, congregations and Jewish people of all denominations continue to explore the relationships between Jewish texts and the LGBTQ plus inclusion in new and different ways.
Can I just say, so we don't allow abortion conversations to explore Judaism and abortion
in new and different ways.
But when the Torah is quite, let's say, explicit in its condemnation of homosexuality, we have to re-examine it in new and different ways. So I think that's called cherry picking.
Yes. And then they have, they had an exhibit saying that, that according to scholars identify, again, they're saying in scholarly work, in, ancient texts, in ancient Jewish texts, scholars identify 6 genders in ancient rabbinical writings, including the Mishnah and the Talmud, written between the 1st and 8th centuries. And then they go on to give the definitions of all of these ones.
8 genders.
6 genders. And, funny enough, they're actually, it's not actually what the modern LGBTQ people are identifying as genders. What is actually identified in the Talmud and those ancient texts is something no one disagrees with, where, for example, children are born, with both sets of sexual organs, or where sexual organs don't develop properly, or in the case of the last one there, and I've put up you can see the whole thing there with the different genders. Saris, the last one, they say, according to this exhibit, they say identified as male at birth, develops female sexual characteristics. I, however, looked up saris. I decided I would look it up myself, and it's not actually at all what saris stand for. In fact, the word saris in Hebrew means eunuch.
Yeah. So what these terms are referring to are actual physical characteristics.
Yes.
They're actually
that nobody argues about.
I suppose that if you're born handicapped, it's a definition of a unfortunate birth. It's a birth defect, actually.
Yes. And they had a word for it in ancient Hebrew. They actually had a word for these things, but they're not having any words for a girl, who decides she's a boy and suddenly she really is a boy. Now, they have no words for that.
Because they recognized that was a mental illness, not a physical illness.
But anyway, I suddenly became really conscious of the fact that there was absolutely nothing in the exhibit anywhere in any part of this museum. Not one word about October 7th. Not one word about what had happened on college campuses across America, where Jewish students, for example, here in Los Angeles at UCLA, were excluded from classes. There wasn't a word about that. Nothing at all
Jews
about
were
that.
attacked for being Jews.
And by the way, there was actually the other thing was there was no mention anywhere that there were Americans who were still hostages in Gaza. That they never mentioned anything about Americans who were kidnapped at a dance party. Not a word about that. So I went actually to the front desk where there was a person who looked like a girl but sounded like a boy. That's all I'll say. Wearing a mask, by the way.
Wearing a
mask.
I
asked, do you have anything here? Where's the exhibit about October 7th? There is nothing. No, but there is an exhibit, by the way, about January 6th.
Yes. Because that is the biggest threat to Jews in America today. People, the January 6th insurrection.
And there's also an exhibit about Islamophobia and how important it is to fight Islamophobia.
In fact, look at that picture there. Fight Islamophobia and fight anti-Semitism are given the same size.
Yes.
So the biggest concern for the Capital Jewish Museum in DC is that they fight Islamophobia and, of course, climate justice. And that's very look. They get a whole part of a wall.
Yeah, but I think my favourite is this part of the exhibit where it says, and I'm just going to read this first before we look at the photograph. Anti-Semitism is an ancient prejudice against Jewish people, including hostile or violent language or activity, often linked with white supremacy and racism. Anti-Semitism is harmful to all in our democracy. And the photograph is of Charlottesville.
As I say, they're living in an October 6th world, and they cannot, actually, they probably haven't admitted to themselves that anti-Semitism is now often linked with progressivism.
Yes. Very much so. In every campus in America. And it's a comfort to see, by the way, when we were walking out, we decided we'd go into the bookstore. So here we have All People Are Beautiful. I think we know what that's about.
This is the Capital Jewish Museum bookshop.
But my favourite was Queer Icons and Their Cats. Look at that. Isn't that lovely?
And there's...
Very nice cat, though.
A very nice cat, actually. Actually, a lovely cat.
It's a lovely cat.
And then above that, you've got 20 protesters who changed America, and it's Colin Kaepernick taking the knee. So, as I say...
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of analysing it, Phelim, is that outside of the museum, we are living in a post-October 7th world, but inside the museum, they haven't heard of October 7th and they're not acknowledging what's going on, which is really something that should be, instead of taking, the whole, as people are calling it, the holy month of pride and filling the whole exhibition with all this stuff about LGBT, the whole alphabet soup. Not a mention of October 7th, not a mention of what's happened on the college campus. Yeah. It's not a mention of all the violence that's happened since, or all the people pulling down hostage posters all over the country, Yes. No, not a word about that.
Not about it. So let's move on to Ireland and its sterling record since October 7th.
It's not getting better.
So here's a pub in Cork that just reminded me, and, by the way, the Holocaust... The Nazis just didn't go straight into the Holocaust. One of the first things they did in 1933, when they finally took real power, was they started a boycott of Jewish goods. It was called the Juden boycott. I love these German words, where they... Juden
boycott.
Yeah, where they just, let's have a word. I mean, let's not have...
Let's just make up a word.
But also, let's not have any artistic wordiness, just call it the Juden boycott.
Juden boycott.
So, now this has come to Ireland. There's a occupied territories bill trying to wheedle its way through Parliament. But think globally, act locally. The Old Oak pub in Cork has said that
on social media, we will no longer broadcast sporting or cultural events involving Israeli teams or representatives because we cannot separate art or sport from politics when people are being killed with impunity, when a genocide is being committed before our very eyes. You decide. Well, I'm not sure about the you decide bit, because obviously you can't decide. If you go to that pub, you're definitely not going to be seeing any Israelis playing any sports.
But I think it's time we reminded people of the long list of anti-Israel, of course, antics and
recent times. By the way, we're not even going back. We're not going back into the ancient history. So we're just going off recent times.
In 2024, in the summer of 2024, in Kerry, they banned 4th of July celebrations and fireworks, not for safety reasons, but because it was an American holiday and America was connected to Israel, so therefore you have to ban the American celebration of the 4th of July.
And one pub in Bundoran put up a sign saying all Zionists are banned from the Celtic Marine Bar. Yep. And in December 2024, Israel closed its Irish embassy due to its anti-Israel policies, according to the foreign minister.
Yes, and then in January, the dear Irish President Michael D. Higgins used a speech at the Holocaust Memorial Day, International Holocaust Memorial Day, used a speech about the biggest massacre of Jews in history, an attempt to wipe out the Jewish race. He used that event to attack Israel. And women who had silent protests about it, they just turned around and turned their back on him. They were dragged out of the room. At a Holocaust memorial event, Jewish people were dragged out because they didn't like, and rightly so, the Irish president using it as
a way to attack Israel, the only homeland that the Jews have.
And as I said, they're trying to push a bill through Parliament to boycott Israeli goods. And then in March 2025, two women spat on an Israeli.
Well, two women actually. It's like they hunted down these Israeli guys who were on a work trip to Dublin, and they'd gone out of their way to discover where these guys were. Found them. They were having a meal in a nice hotel in Dublin, and they spat at them.
Yes, and they flipped them off and said "F Israel," only they didn't use F, and then spat at them again and congratulated herself on her aim. So that is Ireland. That's the dear old Emerald Isle. And, I think it's no coincidence that Ireland is one of the most progressive countries in Europe. And this all comes...
What an awful use of the word progress,
Yes,
it's like
regressive.
Very regressive. But anyway.
And talking of regressiveness, actually, the progressive culture of death is just spreading at an enormous rate.
We met our old friend Wesley Smith in Washington, D.C. Wesley is a podcaster and writer, and he's been recognised especially for his work focused on suicide and euthanasia. And we were very lucky to get him to speak to us earlier, and we'll bring you that interview next. So we're so happy to have our friend Wesley Smith back on our podcast. Wesley is a bioethicist, an author and lawyer, widely recognised for his essential work exposing the rise and growing acceptance of euthanasia. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome back.
Well, thanks for having me. Good to see you.
Yeah, great to see you.
So Wesley, tell us, what's the current state of euthanasia? Every day we wake up, it seems to be spreading to another state in the United States or another country in the world. Is that an accurate picture, or is that just us being paranoid?
I'm afraid it's like cancer metastasizing. It is spreading all around the country and in the world. Most recently, we've seen Delaware approve it here in the United States. It has been legalized in Spain, Netherlands, Belgium. The worst case scenario is Canada. We could talk a little bit about that because they've gone euthanasia crazy. New Zealand. It goes on. And so this is a serious issue, and it is infecting the West.
Why, just before we go forward, I mean, why do you think it's so popular? Why do you think it's growing why is it so acceptable suddenly?
I've pondered that quite a bit. I've been fighting this agenda for 30 years. And I think what's happened is that the purpose of society itself is shifting for many people. It used to be that the purpose of society, the prime purpose, was to protect innocent life. That has shifted in many regards to eliminating suffering. And if you decide that eliminating suffering is the most important thing, that very quickly moves to eliminating the sufferer. And then once you've accepted that premise, the idea of what constitutes the kind of suffering that would justify killing as an answer expands and expands and expands. And so whatever the starting point is, if euthanasia or assisted suicide is legalized, that's not the ceiling. It's the launching pad for further loosening. And to the point where you even have in Germany and Estonia, Supreme Court rulings saying that a suicide itself is a human right based on autonomy, that being assisted in suicide for any reason, we're not talking about health or disability, is a human right, and that assisting is an ancillary human right. And so you are getting to the place where the ultimate destination is slower or faster, death on demand.
Yeah. So, I mean, tell people what's wrong with that. And maybe we should use Canada as an example. You said, let's talk about Canada. Tell us about Canada and tell us why. Tell someone out there who thinks euthanasia might be a good idea to, as you say, to relieve suffering. Tell us what's wrong with it and tell us how that manifests in Canada.
Well, it's actually abandonment, even though it isn't sold that way, and many of the people who support it see it that way. It's based on I think, a total non-confidence vote in the medical system. But again, it's this fear of suffering. But the point is, once you open that door to privatize killing, which is what euthanasia is. It's a lethal injection by a doctor or a nurse practitioner, or promotion of suicide, which is what assisted suicide is, even though they call it something like medical assistance in dying, MAID. These are euphemisms to try to deflect from what's really being done. You open a door to tremendous incursions into human dignity. Now, a lot of people say, well, that's slippery slope argumentation, except it's now facts on the ground. So let's take a look at Canada. Canada has gone from allowing euthanasia of the terminally ill to the chronically ill to people with disabilities to people with elderly frailties and so forth. In 2027, they're going to open euthanasia, lethal jab, to people with mental illness. In Canada, if you decide, as in Ontario, the province, if you decide to ask for euthanasia and the doctor says yes, the doctor then contacts the Organ Procurement Society, who calls you to say, can we have your liver? In Ontario, if a doctor says, I don't want to kill someone, they could be medically disciplined if that person is legally qualified, because the courts have said your freedom of religion and your freedom of conscience, which are explicitly protected in the Canadian Charter, count less than the person having a right to euthanasia. And you either have to kill that person or provide an effective referral, which means you'll find a doctor you know will be willing to kill that person. You just have, in Canada now, more than 15,000 people a year are killed by euthanasia. It's the fifth leading cause of death because the Canadian people have accepted it hook, line, and sinker. People will say, well, what difference does that make? We're the United States. Well, they're just our closest cultural cousins. And in Netherlands and Belgium, you've seen the same trajectory. And in Netherlands and Belgium, a mentally ill person without any physical illness can go into a hospital, be killed, 2 minutes later, wheeled into a surgical suite and organs harvested. It objectifies people. It turns people into a killable caste, and it leads to abandonment. Again, in Canada, you've had people ask for euthanasia because they can't get an oncologist for 9 months. You have doctor teams that go through hospitals for people who are qualified under the law for euthanasia, asking if they want to be killed.
Yeah, right.
So
The
idea that this is some benign, only tiny little itsy bitsy change in medical ethics is baloney. The last 20 years prove it, and people can say, I don't care, but they can't say it's wrong.
It's the first resort now.
It's the first resort. Yeah, I saw a story actually today on X where a woman in Canada had asked for, she needed, I think, a ramp, or she needed a wheelchair because, of her disability, and she was somebody who was an athlete in a prior time in her life. And the first thing that was suggested to her was this medically assistance in dying, as they call it, euphemistically made. And we've actually even come across a neighbour of ours here in California who has just attended her father's death, and I think announced herself as saying, I think I need a hug, and she'd just come back from this rather traumatic situation.
And look at what that puts people in. You are asked to attend a suicide or euthanasia party, which is what they are, a goodbye party. You either don't go, and then people will say you're abandoning your friend, you're abandoning Aunt Edna, or you go and you're complicit in it and you're validating that person's fear. The reason they may be wanting to have themselves killed is fear of being a burden. Well, when you go and say, okay, I'll hold your hand, you're validating that fear. It's not about pain. That's how it's sold. The reason people tend to commit euthanasia or assisted suicide in California or in New Zealand or in Australia it's gone across the board, Belgium, Spain, etc., isn't because of pain. Pain can be alleviated if you get proper medical care. It's because of existential issues such as fear of being a burden, fear of losing the ability to engage in enjoyable activities, fear of your family not remembering you well, and so forth. These are really important issues, but they can be addressed. And when you ask for euthanasia or you ask for assisted suicide, you don't get offered suicide prevention. You get offered suicide facilitation.
Yes.
Yeah. So what we are becoming is a pro-some suicide society, and that's very dangerous for weak and vulnerable people.
Yeah, and obviously, as a society, we're trying to, discourage people from committing suicide. But if you're legalizing this thing, and the medical establishment are in on it, I mean, it certainly does add an extra layer of difficulty to people who might be thinking of suicide.
It's like me saying, I'm going to jump off a bridge, and you come up to me and say, oh, no. Let us help you. We'll find a way out of the darkness. And then I say, well, but I've got cancer. And you say, oh, well, let us hold your coat. It pushes people out of equal moral worth. They no longer have lives equally worthy of protection. And that does destroy people's insides in terms of their self-worth and their self-esteem.
So you got into this whole business through a personal story. And I can you just tell us that story again? Because
Sure.
I think because this kind of came at you from left field. This was not your life plan to spend decades thinking about this, but we're very grateful, by the way, that you have. But tell us about how you got.
Say the least, yeah. In fact, most people on both sides of this issue who get involved have a story. The general public doesn't care that much about this issue. This is not being driven by grassroots. It's being driven by activists, and particularly being driven by people like George Soros, who are pouring millions and millions and millions of dollars into the agenda. But I was a very happy fellow writing books with Ralph Nader. Ralph Nader, when I was a teenager, emerged with Unsafe at Any Speed and was pushing auto safety and consumer rights and so forth. Little did I know, and I obviously don't have the time to get into how this occurred, but I ended up being his friend and co-author. And I couldn't have been happier. It was just like a dream come true.
Yes.
And so I wasn't thinking of these kinds of issues. I wasn't certainly sophisticated in these kinds of issues at all. And then I had a friend commit suicide on her 76th birthday. Her name was Frances. She was a friend of my mother, and I'd gotten to know her because when my first book came out, which was it's called The Lawyer Book, A Nuts and Bolts Guide to Client Survival, was how to be a client and not get screwed. She invited me to speak to her library association in Santa Monica, and I lived in LA at the time. And eventually we became friends, and then she became my mother's friend. Well, Frances kept talking about her deliverance and kind of weird talk like that. And she was very suicidal. She had deep family problems. She had a leukemia, but it wasn't fatal or anything. She had neuropathies and so forth. And her friends kept trying to keep her in life. Then one day she paid a cousin $5,000 to go with her to a hotel room, took an overdose on her 76th birthday, and killed herself with a plastic bag as well. And I was so shocked by this that I contacted her executrix and I said, Frances was the most organized person I know. Send me her suicide file. I want to see what's in this. And what was in it was a bunch of documentation called the Hemlock Quarterly. This was by the Hemlock Society, which is now called Compassion and Choices.
Yeah.
But at the time, it was more honestly named because it was about assisted suicide. And every one of these Hemlock Quarterlies, which isn't published anymore, had stories of assisted suicides, and Frances had underscored it in yellow. They had the drugs to take to make sure you died. They had how to use a plastic bag and this kind of thing. And I was so stunned by this that I wrote a piece for Newsweek magazine called The Whispers of Strangers. It came out in 1993. And it's available online. Just, do a search, Wesley J. Smith, The Whispers of Strangers, and you can read it.
Yep,
and it was about Frances. And I talked about how this could end up leading, for example, to organ harvesting. And I said, as a plum to society. Well, the response I got shocked me. I received about 150 letters. And this is when you had to buy a stamp to tell somebody.
Yes. Very impressive, yes.
Yeah, you had to buy a stamp and buy an envelope and write something on a piece of paper to tell them you hope they die of cancer. And I got so much hate mail, about 130 pieces, 125 pieces hate mail, telling me that Frances was right, euthanasia was dignified, et cetera, et cetera. And even the people who supported my position, which I thought was uncontroversial, by the way. I was just warning about this movement.
Yeah.
Said, well, you're being an alarmist to think that they would ever harvest organs with assisted suicide. And I was thinking, but that's just logical.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, I was right about that. And most of the things I have warned against with regard to this movement have come true or are coming true and are being advocated. That, for example, California, I fought against the assisted suicide law there while I lived there. I helped defeat it a few times, and then I lost that eventually because California legalized. It's already expanded the agenda, that the strict guidelines to protect against abuse. As soon as you pass assisted suicide or euthanasia, the strict guidelines to protect against abuse are redefined as obstacles to a good death. And the agenda expands and expands and expands. It is undeniable. It has happened in virtually every jurisdiction that has legalized either euthanasia or assisted suicide, and it will continue to happen. So that's the debate we should be having instead of this nonsense about terminal illness, because it's not about terminal illness.
Wesley, I watch a lot of medical dramas on the television, and the organ donation is a big staple actually of all these medical dramas, because it's actually, it allows for a lot of drama. And the most recent one was I think it was Chicago Med, and where the billionaire donor to the hospital somehow got the donor heart or donor for his daughter as opposed to this other needy person, and in the end his daughter refused to take it because it wasn't the right thing to do, whatever. But this is, I mean, if these medical dramas were honest and they pride themselves on being, doing
cutting edge,
but doing issues that are really relevant. I mean, there is a donor transplant team in these hospitals that are out there looking for donor actively. And then if you also have a assisted suicide team, and someone is on the fence about assisted suicide, wouldn't you could have the donor transplant team, and of course some of the doctors are unethical in these medical dramas. Surely an unethical donor transplant person would be there saying, it is an easy way out for your chronic illness, and that's a brilliant drama. But they're not going to
highlight what's actually going on.
Yes,
I mean, the last thing you want to do is actually, point up to the fact that this cozy relationship actually already exists.
The problem is that the media and the popular culture are totally in the tank for this agenda, and they tend not to want to report the horror stories that do exist and that can be found if you look really hard. Here's an example from the Netherlands. A young woman, a 16-year-old woman, a young girl, teenage girl, was diagnosed with brain cancer, terribly tragic situation. She asked for euthanasia, not because at that moment that she was having distress that she couldn't handle, but she decided to choose at that time because she wanted to do something, and this was reported in the Dutch media, that she wanted to do something good for people by donating her organs. At that point, she ceased to be a full subject person, meaning it wasn't about her anymore. It was about her organs. She was placed into an artificial coma for 36 hours. That didn't do her any good. The purpose of the coma was to test her organs and to find suitable recipients. So as you can see, she went from being a fully human person. Once they accepted the euthanasia request, she suddenly became an organ farm. And everything was being done toward that end. And that was the tipping point for her to ask for euthanasia. It has been the tipping point for mentally ill people who are not otherwise sick. I have a terrible time getting through the night. Let's give my liver to somebody who could use it better. We've seen transgendered people euthanized because they've been distraught over surgeries. We've seen people with anorexia euthanized, et cetera, et cetera. And the media, I mean, there's a little bit of reporting, but it isn't pushed, certainly in the popular culture, and it isn't driven in the front pages of the New York Times. Although I have to say, the last Sunday, as we're recording this, there was a very good article in the New York Times Magazine, a fair recounting of a woman who was not physically dying or anything like that, who asked for euthanasia because she was so depressed and distraught. And a chaplain came in. As she was about to be killed, she said, "I'm terrified." And the chaplain pushed her to keep going with the killing, saying, "You'll see your dead mother." It was horrible. So
I didn't expect that end to the story. As you told that story, I definitely didn't expect that to be what the pastor would say to her. Oh my God.
Well, I think this is what you're saying. It screws with everyone's moral compass.
It corrupts everything it touches. Another example, in every state in this country, I believe, where assisted suicide is legal, the cause of death is doctors have to lie about what the cause of death is. They can't say it was assisted suicide or aid in dying or one of those euphemisms. They have to say it was the underlying disease. But that wasn't the underlying disease. It was suicide. So that destroys transparency. It distorts suicide statistics. And by the way, studies are beginning to show that where assisted suicide is legalized, it has an impact on the suicide rate overall, an increase in suicides.
No, I mean that seems very obvious to me. If you're living in a society where the medical establishment think it's okay, then sure, why can't I do it myself? Whereas it used to be. I mean, and we've even seen with suicide itself. We've seen this, in Ireland and elsewhere, that I'm old enough to remember that there was a kind of, there was shame in suicide. And in fact, the church were quite harsh about it, that you weren't buried on hallowed ground.
There was a taboo.
And there was a taboo. And actually, even though it sounds very harsh, but there was a value in that. And now it's more like this kind of, and I've unfortunately been to a number of church services for people who kill themselves. And the sort of kind of... It's sort of celebratory, or it's certainly, no one says a word against what was done, or the fact that it's a sin, actually, according to the Catholic Church and many Christian religions and other religions.
But even outside of the Catholic Church and being buried on hallowed ground and so forth, the idea of using euphemisms like "maid" is to say, well, we don't want there to be stigma. Well, sometimes stigma saves lives.
Yes.
Yeah.
If someone is not going to commit suicide because they don't want people to think ill of them because they committed suicide, you've saved a life. It isn't that you want to put anybody down. What we want to do is care for people who are in that darkness. What we want to do is care for people who are in a serious physical situation or an illness. And the idea that, well, we can't, it's terminal non-judgmentalism.
Yes.
We will abandon people
Yeah.
rather than perhaps make them have hurt feelings. It's really a very difficult situation for our society.
I have so many questions, Wesley.
Yeah, me too.
I mean, and this interview can't last forever, though it probably should. So
Maybe the listeners think it already has.
I don't know.
No. I mean,
there's a thing called elder abuse, right?
Yes.
In the law,
yes.
we recognize that elderly people are vulnerable. They're not like
yes. Yeah, full body.
They're not like me, who's not elderly.
That's right. In your prime,
Yes.
Caleb, that's right.
So that say relatives or assistants or nursing assistants can abuse them and can.
And it can be very subtle, by the way,
and can make them do things that they wouldn't have done if they were in the full of their health.
Yeah.
But they're still very alive, right? So why wouldn't these same people, rather than raid their bank account,
well, they can do that too, by the way,
but raid their bank account and then persuade them that what they want to do is go for assisted suicide? Why isn't that elder abuse a criminal elder abuse? Why do we take this aside and say that's not elder abuse, but taking their money is?
That issue, interestingly, I call it euthanasia land. When we're talking about normal circumstances, just like you said, we have to be careful. Elder abuse is rife. People are abused, people are persuaded, people are pressured, and so forth. But then when the subject becomes assisted suicide or euthanasia, suddenly all that disappears. And all we have are loving families and doctors who have known the patient for 50 years. It leads to a fantasy world. My wife and I took care of my mother when she was dying of Alzheimer's disease. She lived with us for the last 5 months of her life. And let me tell you something. She had moments of cogency. If I had wanted her to sign up for assisted suicide, I could have gotten it done. Believe me, I could have gotten it done because I could have found a doctor ideologically predisposed. I could have had her say, yes, of course, what my son says. It would have been not that difficult at all. And as I was going through that experience, I also realized, because it could be difficult, sometimes you're going to have situations where you're putting the ill person out of the caregiver's misery, because it can be very difficult to care for people in extremist circumstances. And we have to be incredibly careful. Yet when we have, ombudsmen to protect and nursing home patients and all kinds of people like that, when it comes to this issue, there are really few protections, if any. And even when perhaps a law is broken, like, for example, Oregon has said, well, there have been cases where they didn't follow the guidelines. Nothing happens.
Yeah.
So it really becomes a wild, wild west situation, especially since most of it is self-reporting by doctors who are going to say that they violated the law about as much as someone's going to tell the IRS they didn't pay their taxes.
Yes.
Right. That's a good one. In the middle of all this, because it's super depressing stuff, Wesley, I mean, is there anything positive, any positive stories that you can share where people, is there any positive stories at all in this, or is it all bad?
No, well, there are positive stories. The fact that the United States hasn't swept into the euthanasia world is positive because the United States is still resisting. People have not swallowed the hemlock. There have also been cases like Michael Friedland in Oregon, where he was diagnosed with cancer. He asked for assisted suicide. After he didn't die a year later, he hadn't died yet. It's supposed to be 6 months or less, right? The doctor called him and said, I need to renew the prescription. Can you believe that? But then a group called Physicians for Compassionate Care found out about his case, intervened, gave him the kind of support he needed because he was really very depressed, helped he and his daughter reconcile. And 3 years after getting the prescription, he died naturally, but he died with his daughter at his side.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that when we engage in these kinds of actions, when we care enough about people to support their lives, even if they're in a situation where they can't support their own lives at that moment, we're expressing love. Love is about caring. It's not about killing. And so there are incredible positives out there. There are stories like that. You've seen the stories in Canada of people with disabilities asking for euthanasia, but then people rallied and gave them the kind of independent support they needed to change their minds. So we should never give up on people regardless of their circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, listen, we're going to have to end this interview, but I mean, there's new laws, there's new crimes in Ireland and England now called coercive control.
Oh, yeah.
Where being sent to prison for coercively controlling someone in a relationship. And this is women in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. But as you say, we are then transferred to this fantasy land where when it's an euthanasia case, there's no such thing as coercive control. There's no relationship with that. I mean, this is a perfect coercive control thing to do is to force the person into euthanasia.
Which is a classic demonstration that people who are qualified to be killed cease to be equals, because we don't care about their lives to the extent we care about people who are not qualified to be killed.
Okay.
On that note.
On that cheery
you can
note.
see why I'm so much fun at parties.
And yes, you are.
So what do you do, Wesley?
Right.
Well,
yeah.
let me tell you.
Yeah,
Oh,
what do I? Yeah. That's right. Yeah,
You
you
don't
meet.
wanna
Yeah,
know.
you meet Wesley at a party. Hey, how are you? What? So I was just whatever over there. What do you do now exactly? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're
Tell me
very
about
grateful.
that.
We're very, very grateful for you, Wesley, and for everything that you've written. And that piece that you talked about, we'll get and put a link up in our show notes to that. The piece from Newsweek, which was really beautiful, that I remember reading. I think that's maybe how I first reached out to you. Although no, I think
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it, and I really enjoy the work you do too. You guys you rock and roll.
Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you, Wesley. All the
Thanks
best.
a lot, Wesley. God bless. Bye bye. Very scary times indeed. We could talk to Wesley all day. He's really a wonderful gift to humanity, by the way, by focusing on this dreadful development.
Yes.
Apparent progress, but obviously very, very regressive.
And Wesley is
legitimizing. It's legitimizing suicide, basically. And people can call it whatever they like, but it's legitimizing suicide. And in fact, if anything, is a real encouragement to people who are suffering from suicidal addiction. Very, very scary.
Yeah, as we said there in the interview, like, how can the mental health industry talk about the rash of youth suicides when these same people are encouraging and almost intimidating older people into suicide? If you're happy enough to be pushing old people into it, why wouldn't young people think that's an acceptable thing to do? When we were growing up, it was unacceptable to commit suicide. It was a major taboo.
Yes.
Now that taboo is broken because the great and the good and the progressives are pushing it.
Yep.
So they are reaping what they sow, and young people are paying for it all over the world. So I don't want to spend too much time on this next story because the podcast is rather crowded at this stage, but yes. I just had to say this and point this out. Christians getting attacked at an actually peaceful protest and then getting blamed for being attacked. So recently,
only in Seattle, by the way.
So basically, there was a Christian event at a park in Seattle recently, and radical leftists, they attacked them and attacked them quite badly. And the Seattle's mayor, his response was not to condemn the attackers. He said, they are here for this very reason, to provoke a reaction by promoting beliefs that are inherently opposed to our city's values in the heart of Seattle's most prominent LGBTQ plus neighborhood, according to a statement issued by the mayor. Now, 23 people were arrested for attacking these people. But what the mayor didn't say was they wanted to have the event somewhere else, but the city forced them into that place. And then the mayor attacks them for being in that place. You can't win. These people want to see your destruction. They want to see you attacked. They want you intimidated. They want an atheistic, nihilistic world. And we have to stand up to that. And talking of an atheistic, nihilistic world, we are going to our regular series now.
Burying the lead.
Okay, so this is a regular series where we look at where journalists accidentally find a story and then get really concerned. So they bury the real story among the rest of the story. So
this one's from the Irish Times,
yes.
right? And it's an extraordinary story. And we'll show you the story there. And it's actually, I think it's a good idea to kind of we'll scroll down and show you how long it takes for this story to get to its main. What's the headline there, Phelim?
So the headline on the story is High Court grants leave for doctors to bring action over state's transgender care policy. It's actually an interesting story, right? So 2 doctors, a consultant endocrinologist and a psychiatrist, are basically suing the Irish Health Service, saying you are destroying children by your pursuing this ideologically based transgender affirmation of mentally disturbed children. Now, I'm obviously paraphrasing them, and they're actually suing the government, saying this has to stop. In defense of the journalist, this is a court report. They're talking about a court happening, but very often I've covered many court reports and something interesting comes out of a court report.
Of course.
And the editor first says, A, that's the lead, but B, follow that up. That cannot be let stand. This needs to be followed up. So,
as you scroll through the story, it's all very interesting. A review of this model impacts Ireland, with more than 230 children and young people from Ireland experiencing gender dysphoria, where a person feels a mismatch between their biological sex and their gender identity might cause unease, dissatisfaction, anxiety, depression. You're keeping on coming on through the story. Young people getting referred for assessment abroad. Now we're getting somewhere interesting. And here's where the real story eventually comes in paragraph 14 and 15. 14 and 15. Mr. Jeffers has also submitted that HICWA, that's the regulatory board, had a care pathway established by the health board where Irish children are now referred to a private clinic in Antwerp, Belgium, by a non-medically trained trans activist. Now that's the story. So you have a situation where children from Ireland are being sent to a clinic in Antwerp, Belgium.
Puberty blockers and surgery.
For who knows what, by the way.
Yes.
And the person doing the referral
is not
medical, but is actually an activist.
And then they talk about the clinic.
The clinic is very worrying. The clinic in question is located in Antwerp and is operated by an endocrinologist by the name of Dr. Klink.
Who should be in the clinic by the sounds of it.
The complaints allege the clinic had no model of care or discernible operational guidelines Mr. Jeffers had submitted to the court.
So a non-medically trained trans activist is recommending that mentally disturbed children are sent to Belgium from Ireland.
To a clinic that has got no real standards there's no real actual standards of care for these particular children that they can find.
So any journalist worth his salt then, would... Any editor, actually, worth his salt.
First of all, identify who this trans activist is.
Yes, I'd love to know who this trans activist is.
By the way, if you're in such a position of such power, people should know. And by the way, I imagine a lot of this travel, etc., is paid for by taxpayers.
All of it. On the surgery and everything, it's billed to the Irish Health Service. It's billed to the Irish taxpayer. Who's the trans activist? How many children have they recommended? What standards do they have? How did they get appointed? Do you have to apply for the job?
Is there a longitudinal study of how these children have fared after they've been to this place in Antwerp? Have we talked to them? There's a story there, but we're not getting it from the Irish Times. So that's another one of our bury the lead stories, it's fascinating and it's very disturbing because you start reading and it's like, as you said, Phelim, you look at the headline, you think, well, that's very interesting, actually. Let's have a read. And then the next thing is like this explosion at the very end of the story that then doesn't get picked up on and no further, there's no further information for now. But let's see, maybe the Irish Times will surprise us, Phelim.
Yes. So from burying the lead to burying the documentary.
Burying the documentary altogether. Are we going to talk about our old friend Josh Fox, Phelim?
Josh. Look at him.
Josh Fox.
There's Josh. Can we put up the picture of him smoking the cigarette?
I don't remember that.
Yes, no, he does. He got very upset about it. This is a guy who's campaigning for clean air and he smokes. Anyway, he's an award-winning lying filmmaker. Actually, it's a tautology, because I think in order to win awards as a documentary filmmaker, you have to lie. I don't think they give awards.
Very good film.
No, I mean, seriously, I think documentaries that tell the truth do not win awards. So we know Mr. Fox very well.
Mm-hmm.
In his documentaries Gasland 1 and 2, he made so many debunked claims about fracking. We actually made a whole documentary called Frack Nation, which was taking on Gasland 1,
yes,
and exposing the lies. And I mean, you may remember we exposed the flaming faucets, showing that it was perfectly natural. There had been flaming faucets and flaming springs and flaming...
And if you discover that the water that is coming out of your faucet in your house is flammable, please get in touch with us, because we'd be very interested in buying your land.
Yes, because it means there's a lot of gas down there. There's been flaming springs and burning springs in America for hundreds of years.
And now that Trump is back in the White House, maybe we could actually be able to explore that and exploit all that oil and natural gas.
So, however, he also, in a kind of one-off short documentary, which he then didn't put into his second Gasland, interesting enough, he called it The Sky is Pink, and he falsely claimed there was a breast cancer spike in Texas where there was a lot of fracking. Let's play our clip from Frack Nation debunking that claim.
But perhaps Josh Fox's most outrageous lie is his infamous breast cancer hoax.
In Texas, as throughout the United States, cancer rates fell, except in one place, in the Barnett Shale.
But the Associated Press checked that claim and found it to be false. Professor Simon Lee from the University of Texas, David Risser, an epidemiologist at the Texas Cancer Registry, and Susan G. Komen for The Cure, all said there was no spike in cancer in the Barnett Shale.
So he just decided to frighten women, and now he knows that. So this is kind of a journalism thing, but it's also about honor and not frightening people. He put out that short documentary between Gasland 1 and 2. Now, so he believes that fracking causes breast cancer. He didn't put that into Gasland 2. But he didn't withdraw the claims from The Sky is Pink. So he allowed those claims to be out there, but knew that if he put them into Gasland 2, he would be laughed out of court. So we decided, remember that, Anne? We decided to confront him about it because they had the premiere of Gasland 2 in New York. And Anne McElhinney here beside me, I do remember this.
Very, very well.
Yes. We were preparing to ask him questions on the red carpet, and Anne McElhinney said to me,
on our way walking to said red carpet, whatever you do, don't go completely nuts when you get there.
And don't be shouting.
And don't be shouting.
And don't go crazy.
And I think you probably know what next and what happened next.
Let's play the clip of Anne McElhinney going crazy and shouting at Josh Fox. Okay, let's play that clip now.
How can you lie? How can you lie about fracking?
And then we got banned from the screening, even though we had ticket. And all these farmers who'd come from 4:30 in the morning from Pennsylvania to see what he was saying about their community, they were banned as well because almost by association. But that tells you the kind of person Josh Fox is. Now he's apparently working, and he has been for many years, like 5 years, working on a documentary about the COVID whistleblower, Rebecca Jones. You might remember her. She claimed that she had access to the Florida database of COVID deaths and that Ron DeSantis was
killing people and covering it up.
Yes.
Brilliant story.
Yes. And she became a leftist hero for a while. She ran as a Democrat for Congress. But then stuff came out about her past. She's basically been charged and accused of cyber stalking and sexually harassing a man she had a relationship with, all the gory details. But Fox was happy enough to ignore these truths or to brush over them because she was good for a wider narrative. But now Fox, who is Jewish, has a bigger problem because Jones went on an unhinged anti-Semitic rant. Now remember, he's making a documentary about this woman as the great hero of the last 5 years. She went on an unhinged anti-Semitic rant after the DC shooting, where she said, "If you're in
the United States and you're actively working and promoting a country that is committing a Holocaust that is resulting in the slow starvation of tens of thousands of babies, then maybe you should not feel safe."
And by the way, that's based on false information that there was 14,000 babies starving. But let's play.
Yes, that story that was widely debunked, complete nonsense.
Yes.
That 14,000 babies were about to die within 48 hours. Complete nonsense.
Let's play the worst thing she said, though. Let's play that now.
That's a pretty easy one too. Don't go to concerts outside concentration camps. Low-key have no sympathy for people who do that.
So that's a reference to the
Nova Party.
Nova Festival, which was down close to Gaza. And by the way, most of the people, I would venture, who went to the Nova Festival would have been peaceniks, would have been pro-Gaza, pro-Palestinian, up to a certain point. And she is saying she has no sympathy for the 200, I think it was 260, or was it 300 young men and women who were murdered at the Nova Festival. A real charmer, really. Now, Fox...
So that's a little bit difficult. You got a documentary that's basically based on this heroine, I should say, inverted commas, who turns out to be a nut job in every kind of sense of the word, and also an anti-Semite.
Fox, who's Jewish.
He has a problem.
To be fair, he was very clear after the Washington, D.C. shooting. He said, this is what happens when you globalize the Intifada.
Yes.
This is what happens when you dehumanize us. Actually, I actually said the same thing. I think I posted. This is when you...
Yes, it is exactly what you said.
When you dehumanize a nation, when you dehumanize a people, when you call a nation genocidal, when you call a people genocidal, then...
It justifies
the moral thing to do
is to take them out.
Is to shoot a nation, to shoot a people, no matter where you find them. So... what is he going to do? And he has called his documentary in the past a nuanced, complex character portrait.
Oh, yeah.
So what's he going to do now?
With this very nuanced. It's even more nuanced than it was before.
And I think he started filming in 2020. He started a Kickstarter to finish the film. The Kickstarter was launched in July 2023, almost 2 years later. Mm-hmm. Where is the documentary? He raised money for it. Where is that money gone? Is the documentary coming out? We need to know, Mr. Fox.
These are things we need to know.
I might write to him and ask him. I'll write to him and see if I get a response.
No, okay. I think we know what he's going to do if we write to him, Phelim.
Yes. So we've had some great responses. We love hearing all your thoughts. Leave your comments below the YouTube or on Apple comments on the Apple podcast, or you can go to our Substack and please get involved in the debate there. The Substack is stories.io. So here's just some quotes from...
I like this from Carol. Thank you, Phelim, for reading Original Sin so we don't have to. Much appreciated. And by the way, I think it's been remaindered or whatever. I think the book is doing really badly in sales.
It was the most talked about book, to be fair.
Oh, for 2 weeks.
Yeah, and I looked... a few nights ago, it was at 100 in Amazon sales. I think it's still doing okay, but I think it definitely the color is off it, the shine is off it. Then
a lot of people liked our collaboration with Mark Stein and enjoyed the interview and basically said, "Do more, please."
Yes, and then someone said, "I listened to the Kevin Spacey podcast. Are you going to do any more?" So please go to the Kevin Spacey Trial Unfiltered. It's one of our best podcasts.
Yeah, we're
and
very
it's about
proud
a story that needs to be publicized. And another person, Vincent Christopher King, said, "Can we make suggestions for guests on podcasts? Please, 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 please. We would love to hear your suggestions and we will follow them. Don't forget, leave your comments. Let us know how we're doing. Thank you very much. Bye.
See you next week. Bye."